legislation.
Right.
At the meeting last week that I wasn't here for, all this was discussed, and it was ironed out a plan to basically take that current year unspent bond proceeds of $1 million, and then is the other $1 million coming from the capital bond fund to take it solely so that it does not have to be bonded this year?
Yeah, the entire conversation is, if I can boil it down, was we have extra money over here that we haven't spent yet. We need to spend that by December 31st, okay? We'll take that $1 million because it's an easy spend, and rather than borrowing $2 million, we're only going to be borrowing $1 million, and we're going to spend the other $1 million from this previous bond. So $1 million from this bond plus $1 billion from this new bond is equal to your $2 million.
So in the context of what we'll hear tonight, Alderman Lippman's amendment about this, it is not that assuming we go forward with the bond issuance as is described this year,
right,
we will still be bonding money for roadways in this year's budget.
Yes, but
we'll just be bonding half as much as we would have been.
Well, if I understand Alderman Lippman's recommendation, is reduce and do pay-go for the entire amount and move the borrowing down to zero and increase taxes or transfer from the capital reserve.
Sure, but so just the order of things. So we can have that conversation tonight. The Finance Committee will recommend a package here that has $1 million of previous sort of allocated bond funds to this and $1 million that still will be bonded, and that will be the landscape of which he'll try and amend.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So I mean that obviously having the GT to do that makes sense to me. Is there? So I mean, we're covered in the $2 million that's been recommended for approval.
Right. That was that.
So Alderman Arnett, what other questions do you have about if that's sort of nailed down?
Well, my first, I think the goal of the Finance Committee is to make sure we have all the accounting for the capital, the CIP and the capital budget, and I think that this for 025-17 as amended will reflect the amount going from bond funding down. I still think we're kind of hanging out in the ether about the amount we're spending on roads, but
but if
I'll
we
take a
do an amendment to the underlying budget.
I hate to say this, but trust the accountants when it comes to
the
audit trail too.
Yeah, trust the politicians too.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I think there'll be more clarity before we get to the end of the budget process, but
you do?
Well, assume we do the amendment we were just discussing. I think it will be clear that it'll 100% come out of the bond issuance, which is the point that's trying to be made, right?
Right.
Or are you an optimist?
So, other questions, or are we ready to recommend this as it was amended the other day?
I'm ready, and I made the motion that we amend the capital improvement program schedule in two ways. One, column L and O, lines 14 would be amended to read 1 million as opposed to 2 million, and then column M, line 43, would add 500,000 or whatever the increment is from the increase in these. What is it called? Restoration, whatever the new language is.
It's still stormwater.
Yeah.
I'm going to put I do not think you want to put the full $500,000 in, because we get that on a quarterly basis. So we're not going to collect everything up in year one. We still need I would say 250 or 200. But
it's worse and worse.
Well,
I hear cans.
Well, I think there are discussions which have been articulated, and I won't repeat them. I think it's. But then
Well, I have no idea what the amendment should be then.
Okay.
I think you appropriate the $500,000, you don't spend it until until the money is collected, because you're not being authorized to do it out of additional borrowing.
I will be very happy to be as tight can be, and not sign any contracts,
Yeah, I mean,
with the acknowledgement that, finance may be sitting on contracts until the appropriate level of revenues are there. But that needs to be understood. So put $500,000 in.
Yeah, and I think, yeah. The reality is, right, for these type of projects, when you have the $1 million and the 500,000, the question is, like, how many projects will you be doing in a particular year, and what chunk of dollars are those? My guess is there is a substantial sort of lead time on it. And all
There
that
is.
stuff. So I think everyone understands that. Yeah. Okay.
So that was,
Procurement process.
my motion was to amend,
So the Arnett amendment is to
amend columns L and O, line 14, to move it from 2 million to 1 million. Amend column M, line 43, to add $500,000.
Okay.
That would be the increment from the increase in the reclamation fee, stormwater management fee.
It's okay to use the actual words until we change the words.
Right.
Sure. Is there a second, Priscilla?
Well, I wanted to comment
Sure.
first. We've already amended column L, line 14. We did it last time.
Not here on the CIP. We only did it on this,
We have. I note the,
The CIP chart before you won't be amended until the amendments are passed by the full city
Right.
council. But on Tuesday, the finance committee approved an amendment to change roadways from 2 million in bond funding to 1 million in bond funding. So today,
at the last finance committee meeting, we did this piece of paper with this GT.
Yeah, but we're still on the capital improvement program.
I
That's
know.
for the bond issue.
Right, so I don't think we voted at the last finance committee to change the CIP.
I disagree. We certainly didn't touch the
Where are the minutes?
stormwater fund. I agree with you on that.
Redundancy won't hurt.
So we have an amendment to do what you did on Tuesday.
All over again.
All over again. Second.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Do we have a, sure,
Um,
Finance Director.
I believe you also want to include a amendment to increase the parking fund by $615,000
Oh, yeah.
for
That's
the
all.
wayfinding.
That's already
It's already? Okay.
in there.
Okay.
Yeah, that was in the finance committee.
The initial Finance Committee package.
report.
Okay, so this will be, this amendment will be written up and put in the package? Good. Thank you. If there's no other amendments, do we have a recommendation?
May I have a
Sure.
question?
Alderman Finley.
So where is Russell Street in all of this?
Still in the previous package. of
Russell
amendments.
Street was included in the first set of finance committee
Okay.
amendments to the
Yeah.
CIP.
Okay, so we haven't undone anything that was done before?
Correct.
No,
Okay.
that's Russell
Wayfinding,
Street,
Barba.
Barba Lane, Maynard Burgess, to be funded through the capital reserve, and that's one.
Okay. Just want to check.
Yeah. Place to be safe.
Okay, so if
Thank
there's no other amendments to consider, do we have a recommendation to the full council on the underlying ordinance O 2217?
Sure, I'll make the motion.
Okay.
I'll second, but can you explain again what O 2217 does?
It's the capital budget for the fiscal year that we just amended. So it's basically favorable recommendation as amended, which includes the Finance Committee amendments that we talked about before, as well as this most recent pass at the plan of fixing some of the numbers that match
Okay.
up.
If
So-
only I could pull it up on my iPad, I could look at it, but it reflects this table that we had last time, wherever that's gotten off to, that changes the number to 6.6 $6 million?
No, we're going on to that next. This is the capital budget itself. So, okay.
Okay, all right.
So moved and seconded, favorable recommendation as amended. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, and then the other related piece is 2517, which is the issuance of bonds and bond anticipation notes. And when you discussed it last week, it looks like some amendments were made to reflect that the roadways funding. Was that agreed to by the Finance Committee at that point?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any
So we
other?
accepted GT
So it
10,
matched up the
17,
GT with it,
right.
and then,
and 02517.
okay.
Okay, and I want to be, just as staff, so I'm clear.
So that-
We've decreased it by the bond ordinance by $1 million, but we have to increase it by $615,000 for the wayfinding. So I recommend
We make
to the
another-
Finance Committee that they increase the authorization by let's say $616,000 for wayfinding signage.
Okay. Is there an amendment to do that?
I'm trying to,
So basically adding, because we have added that in
CIP.
the list, we have to reflect that in what, the list of bond issuance. And obviously, this is subject to change once we get to the full vote on the budget, if there is some attempt to do something else. But in that case, the number will just be getting smaller, not bigger. So basically, having a dollar amount that we can issue in the current year is fine, but if you come in below it, you're good.
so this table gets some additional change to it?
To add
Right.
615,000 for wayfinding.
That's correct.
So that's a whole new line then, right?
That's correct.
So we have to add a line and increase the amount. Now, what does that do to the language? Because we left in the not to exceed language, but didn't we lower that from 7.3 million to some other
That's
number?
what we're saying, we need to.
So now we gotta go back
Gotta
up.
float back up, yeah.
They understand that amendments can be made, they're not going to use.
Okay, so,
So is the recommendation to just basically leave the not to exceed number alone?
No, the recommendation is to increase the not to exceed by an additional $616,000 to facilitate the wayfinding signage. Because last week, if it's my understanding, we reduced it by $1 million. Now we have to increase it by 616. So a net decrease of about $400,000.
Well, okay, there are two numbers here. There's
Okay.
the borrowing number in the table,
Right.
which adds up to, which we're decreasing by $1 million.
And then adding 616.
And that, right. And then there is the not to exceed number in the ordinance,
Right.
which my understanding was the Finance Committee voted or recommended to lower from 7.3 million to 6.5.
That's correct.
They didn't lower it an even million.
No.
Right.
But
So-
that's because of other,
Right,
Right.
so are you adding the 615 just straight back into the,
yes, sir.
okay. Just trying to understand what.
No, I got you.
So does that get added to the 6.5, or are we just going back to the not to exceed
No, you're
7.3?
doing the two numbers, as Alderman Budge noted. You're increasing that table by $616,000.
Right, which
And
gives us $6,228,503.
And then you're adding the same 616 back to the not to exceed amount. You got
Well,
those numbers?
So that was 6.5, so we're up to 7.1503.
Right.
Why not just leave it at the 7.3? I mean, I don't care, but
Depends upon how
it's so
much
close
control.
to 7.3, you just don't amend it.
We're trying to be as
Yeah, I mean,
tighten.
So the 7.3, what's the derivation? Is there a margin that you put on top of the borrowing for expenses and
for
things like
running
that?
expenses
And
issuing
what is
costs.
that? Is it the amount of borrowing times 5%? or-
Well, it's not linear. There are some fixed fees. There are some fees that are based on the size of issuance. For example, the fixed fees, the rating agencies, they don't care how big it is. You know, their rating is your rating. So that's a fixed cost. There are other costs that are fixed because, variable because of the size of the issuance. So it's
So-
hard to say just 10% or 6%.
Historically, do we reach the not-to-exceed number? Do we never reach it? Do we exceed it?
We typically are under it. We are under it because it provides flexibility. So if we have to pay, the printing bills for the POS offering statement, and that's what cover those costs.
So in the language of the ordinance on line 5, the $7.3 million becomes 7,1,228,503?
I would say 7.2.
Okay, 7.2. So 7.273, why bother to amend it?
If that's your, again, when we recommended to decrease it, it was because of the $1 million.
Right.
You know, it was just trying to be transparent as we possibly can.
And in the ordinance, the projects that are approved in the CIP are going to be listed in there. So depending, whatever the amendments are tonight, it will have to be amended to include those projects.
Right.
so as the maker of the amendment here, Alderman Arnett, I mean, if you'd like to leave it alone at the previous number, feel
I
free to do
think
it that way.
the less moving parts, the better. So I think that the critical number is the attachment that shows the project and the bond funding amount. That number went down by $1 million, but went back up by 615. So I think that the new bottom line is, instead of 613,503 is 6,228,503. But I'd leave that up to the finance department to.
Yeah, so they'll produce
Right.
the updated table.
So it
for,
was down by $1 million and back up by 615.
Exactly. So that's, it's on a separate.
It's on the,
the
it's
staff
in the
report.
ordinance.
Yeah. If we go on to- Yeah, so the amendment would be to add the 615 in and adjust the numbers for the two numbers for the amount to borrow as well as the list of projects bond funded accordingly.
You just, again, it's 616, not 616.
616.
Right.
Okay, so that is the motion. Is there a second?
Well,
Second.
moved. I
You did.
moved. I'll
Second.
also second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, so we've favorably recommended these two pieces as amended. Is there anything else we need to get into?
Well, I do think, because there's been a lot of discussion going back and forth amongst some of us, it would be good for the Finance Committee to discuss the policy of dipping into fund balance. It would be nice to know what the number is, and I think Rhonda asked for this at a previous meeting. What is the number that is being characterized as prior year's savings? And I think she was given a number of around $800,000. In the sheet that Alderman Budge kindly prepared for us, it looks like we're implicitly dipping into that by, if I've got it right, Joe, $755,900. That is really fund balance, but are we pretending that this is prior year savings? And if so, what is the amount of prior year savings? And I think after we get an answer to that, then we need to get into what is the policy? We are the policymakers, the council, and I certainly will be asking this tonight. What is our policy on dipping into fund balance? Implicit in the discussion is if we're dipping into it, we believe that we have more than the minimum amount of money we need in fund balance. So which means we have enough, and then apparently we have more because we're feeling free to dip into it. We seemingly are feeling free to dip into it to give a tax rate reduction, which isn't an inappropriate thing to do. If we built up too much surplus, why would we continue to raise taxes? But I don't know that we've had any explicit, I know we haven't on the Finance Committee, and I don't believe we have as a council, about how we're managing this fund balance for prior year savings.
Yeah, I mean, implicit in the budget that was delivered to us is a sense that we're at the perfect amount, and we got.
No,
we just,
we're
we
too
got,
high.
Yeah, exactly. We got just enough. We got all the government we need. We got all the services we provide, and now it's time to start turning it backwards. And that, I don't think that's been sort of fleshed out in our conversations about what that should be. But
Well, and it speaks to Alderman Lippman's proposal that we convert bond funding to pay-as-you-go for routine maintenance. Is there $3 million extra surplus? And will we always have $3 million extra surplus so that we can do annual street and sidewalk repairs out of current revenues as opposed to issuing bonds?
sure, Alderman Payon.
Look, that's a very complicated issue. I mean, many of us, if not most of us, agree in principle with what he is saying, but as applied here is the problem. I mean, where do you draw the line? If we're going to repave West Street
I asked you first.
and Main Street in the same year, do you really think that's fair to burden the taxpayers right now for repairs that are going to last 30, 40, 50 years? If people are going to use it, they get off the hook free, get to use it for nothing because we've already paid for it out of our tax dollars. That doesn't seem fair to me. On the other hand, we both, you and I particularly at length, had discussions about using bond debt for ordinary expenses, and I
Right.
couldn't agree more with
Right.
what he says, but I just don't know how we apply that here.
But the answer, is it fair to charge people more property taxes than we need? Implicit in all of this discussion is we have a fund balance that is bigger than we need. So I don't know what the answer is. How big a fund balance do we need? I thought that was one of the things that our financial advisor spoke to us about. It is certainly something that has come up in the union negotiations, and I don't think that we have been given information from the administration, nor have we as policymakers come up with a policy statement. But if we have more than we need in fund balance, why wouldn't we use fund balance to fund annual operating expenses like sidewalks, streets, and vehicle replacement, for example? We're borrowing money, bonds, to buy vehicles. So we're paying 4 times as much for vehicles as if we had paid cash for it. So I don't know what the answer to those questions are, but it seems to me we ought to know that before we go spending it.
Alderman Budge?
I would hasten to point out that taking money out of fund balance, capital reserves, or whatever, or financial reserves, or savings, whatever you want to call them, should not be confused with pay-as-you-go. The pay-as-you-go means the operating budget is paying for these items out of current operating revenues.
No, I agree.
And we're not talking about doing that. If the fund balances are excessive, yes, it is reasonable to pay for them out of savings instead of borrowing. Certainly lowers interest costs and debt service costs. But if we're thinking that our fund balances are excessive, we also need to think in terms of other obligations that we have, such as our pension liabilities, which are also underwater. It's not just
capital projects in the CIP.
I agree, it's a two-step process. One is we can decide for some period of time, maybe just this year, maybe for a while, to run down those balances. That is not the same thing as having an explicit policy of saying that street, roads, vehicle replacement are always going to be pay-as-you-go. We did have a policy, and it was removed a couple of years ago, to set aside a fund for buying new vehicles, automobiles for the staff and so forth, out of a revolving fund, and that was pay-as-you-go. We didn't fund that a couple of years ago. We were talking about using zip cars or some other exotic thing instead of buying cars. So I agree that it's a two-step process, but I don't even think we've gotten to step one. How much extra money do we have in fund balance?
Mr. Finance Director.
As you have illustrated, there are a lot of moving parts to this conversation. One of the first things I would recommend doing is, as you decide what an appropriate level is another component of this conversation is where do you want to be with your ratings? Because your rating agencies have thresholds relative to benchmarks. So if you want to be a AA category or a AAA category, that's going to dictate's a hard word, but it will influence where you want to be on your as a percentage where you want to be. The other thing that I would throw out is as you decrease your fund balance, you put more and more pressure on your working capital being cash. If you recall, I think about 4 or 5 years ago was the last year that we had to borrow short-term for to run the government. And we had a line of credit up to, I believe, $10 million. When you lower your equity accounts, you lower your cash. It's not a one-for-one relationship, but you do lower your working capital, your cash, and therefore you put more pressure. So I don't think this is something that, quite honestly, you're going to get to this morning. I think it's one of those conversations that we should be very, very deliberative in the process and the evaluation, because there's a lot of moving parts, and I think there could be unintended consequences if you were just to say, well, for this memo we got $15 million, we can take it down to 10 and boom, be done with it, because there's going to be a sequence that follows that. So I just caution. I agree, you guys are the policy, and it's up, it's your policies, but we should have all the facts in front of us and what the unintended impacts will be.
But we don't have the facts in front of us, and we are spending the money. So we're flying blind. We are, for example, I put forward, and this committee voted 2-1 to spend money for 4 new staff people, and the notion was that we were going to take it out of we were going to finance it by not decreasing the tax rate. And then when Joe did his analysis for us, it turns out that we are, in effect, in my mind anyway, giving the tax rate decrease out of fund balance. We have no idea what the amount of fund balance is. Is it this number, $1.5 million? I mean, I don't know, but I don't even know, you use words occasionally called like unrestricted fund balance. Is that the amount? We saw from the financial advisors that a good target is 20%, that people who are municipalities that are best practice municipalities have that target. We're over 20%. I don't know what the numbers are. We don't have it funded. Pardon?
20.38 of government-wide expenditures.
Right.
The fund balance is a measurement as of June 30th of each year. You don't do it mid-cycle because we're basically a bona fide accrual basis of accounting, so you can't really get a good fund balance number. So yes, unassigned or unrestricted are numbers that are pretty much interchangeable, saying that there are no demands on that money, no restrictions on that money. We do have restricted fund balances. That restricted fund balance primarily, good example would be money that we borrowed. When you borrow money, that does go to fund balance, but it's restricted because it's for the purpose of using those bonds. So you can't use the bonds for operating. So that's why it's restricted. It's restricted for a specific purpose. The budget stabilization fund of $1.5 million, that's also restricted for the budget stabilization, which you can use for operating purposes. The capital reserve is restricted for the $5 million for capital. So they do. So the more that you earmark these funds, the more restricted these buckets become.
Well, I would ask my colleagues on the Finance Committee, and obviously all the colleagues that are here, is how good do you feel about dipping into these monies without really knowing where we are, how much it is? Does this say, under number 1, that our target is 20% and we're at 20.38? So 0.38% of 15,816,683 is the amount that we're over our target, and therefore could be refunded to people in terms of a tax cut or used for other purposes and not get out of whack with our guidelines for our different fund balance piles. What is our goal for the capital reserve? Is it 5% and we're at 6.44? I mean, I don't know. I have no idea what the policies are, or the numbers are.
We have not gotten that granular relative to...
But we have Alderman Littman proposing to dig into this $5 million. Does that take us below our target, our best practices target?
Well, in theory, the $5 million is intended to be used for capital. If you want to...
So it's all fungible? We could spend all of it and not have a capital reserve?
Arguably, yes. Or this board may want to say this, and we want to have a 3% threshold. We're not going to go below 3% threshold for some type of emergency. I mean,
And I think answering those questions every year when you make appropriation is setting the policy every year. You can
Yeah,
choose
de
to do it or
facto it
choose
is.
not to do it as the council deems
Yeah,
appropriate.
we're implicitly setting a policy. I don't feel good about an implicit policy. When we dig into this, when we give tax cuts, when we spend money for more staff, we are implicitly making a policy decision, but we're not knowingly making it because we really don't know the numbers that we're dealing with. And we really don't know what the targets are. So we could spend $15,816,687 on new staff
No.
this year and be okay.
no, that is not what this says.
Well, tell me what it says. That's what I'm asking.
I don't know if you're being... This says that you have a unassigned general fund balance of $15 million, almost $16 million,
Right.
which is approximately 20% of government-wide expenditures, okay?
And I think the 15 legislation says our goal is 15%.
15%.
Not so.
So there could be arguably a 5% delta, okay? Now, as you mentioned, there has been conversation of trying to get up to a higher threshold to pursue a higher rating, okay? That's a policy decision. That's very much in your wheelhouse relative to, do you want 15% or do you want 20%? Now, facetiously, yeah, you could spend $15 million on your operating budget, okay? But next year, you're not going to have it. okay, and we know that, all right? The discipline is maintaining that unassigned general fund balance, okay? And that's why the budget stabilization fund was created to give you a little bit more flexibility so that if you wanted to take money from your savings account, you could take money from your savings account and not impinge on the unassigned general fund balance, because the unassigned fund balance is really the grading, if you will, from the rating agencies. The amount of money in the budget stabilization fund is to help facilitate those occasional bumps in the operating budget, so you can get through that, okay? Arguably, there's definitely more work that you guys probably want to put into the establishing fund balance thresholds and fund balance targets, but there is flexibility and that's why we did 2 years ago, is to provide this, the state council flexibility when it comes to appropriating a budget via the mechanism of the budget stabilization fund.
I think I've exhausted the amount that I'm saying that I'm uncomfortable. If I look at this, it seems to me the goal for the budget stabilization fund is 3%. We're not there. So if that is a safety net, it seems to me we should be adding to that, not taking from it, till we get to this cushion of 3%. Once we reach that cushion of 3%, we would be able to say, all right, we don't need to keep accumulating there. And that 3% is of government-wide expenses. Same thing on line 1. The goal we have is 15%. We're at 20.38. So it seems to me that if 15 is really the goal, and I do think that's not what the financial advisors, they'd recommend a higher number, we've exceeded our goal, and therefore that is money that could be used to reduce tax rates, could be used to increase contributions to the police and fire pension plan, could be used to buy more staff. Alderwoman Finlayson always is pointing out that we're giving more jobs to people but not hiring more people. If that's the case, it seems to me here's some money to hire more staff. All of those items. Pardon?
And how would you pay for that continuing?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that we've overaccumulated.
Well,
5.38%.
This is where I think it's your decisions, your policies, but you, as you mentioned, if you want to get to a higher threshold so that we can move to a AAA,
Where is that threshold?
that would be over 20%.
Where's the paper that shows us that?
You've heard that from the
I know that, and so what are we doing about that?
What are you
Well,
gonna
I
do,
think if it's
Mr.
going to
Chairman?
be our new policy, we should put it in a resolution and have it be our new policy. And then these numbers would change. So it wouldn't be 15%, it would be 20%, which means we have an excess of 0.38%.
If that's what you want to do, I mean,
Alderman Budge?
So, let me see
You
if I
know
understand
that's what I
this.
want to do, because I've been asking for it for months.
okay.
Good, let's do that.
Joe?
So let me see if I understand this budget stabilization fund policy correctly. That basically says that half of prior year general fund surplus goes to the budget stabilization fund until we have reached 3% of government-wide expenditures, and then the fund can be used for operating purposes, for one-time expenses. The budget stabilization fund presently has 1.5 million in it, which is just shy of 2% of government-wide expenses. So the policy that we adopted in 2015 says that we should not be taking anything out of the budget stabilization fund at all at this point.
Right.
the budget that the mayor proposed to us takes $600,000 out of the budget stabilization fund for sidewalks. So just out of the gate, it's in violation of this policy. Is that a correct interpretation?
I would, it doesn't say, the transfer is really from the unassigned general fund balance, not from the budget stabilization fund. That's where the flexibility is.
How do we know that from the pro forma?
The pro forma is not that granular.
No kidding. But still, I mean, that's what I'm saying. We're making implicit policy decisions, and we're making it unknowingly. Until Alderman Budge did his analysis, I admit I hadn't focused on the 775, 900, which it seems to me is spending that is not covered by revenue and is coming out of some fund, whether it's the unassigned general fund or the budget stabilization.
You just said unassigned.
Yeah.
Again, last year we had about $3 million of, a little north of $3 million of surplus. And that's where you get the $1.5 million from the budget stabilization fund. Okay, and then, no money going into the capital reserves. And the residual amounts going into the unassigned general fund balances. I'm trying, so to Alderman Budge's question, because we have not reached the 3%, that additional, those funds coming out are coming out of the unassigned general fund, okay?
Which is a different bucket of money than the budget stabilization fund.
Correct.
Okay.
And then in the future, and not to confuse the issue, and I probably will, but the additional conversation is to have a third category where which is called the rainy day fund. So that the rainy day fund would be actually pull money from the unassigned general fund, and that's where the source of funds would be for the rainy day fund. So then so you would have those essentially four categories of fund balance from which you could expend funds from. Just the unassigned amount, the rainy day fund, the budget stabilization fund, and then finally the capital reserve. Those you could appropriate from, okay? The restricted pieces of fund balance, you cannot appropriate funds because they're restricted for some purpose. So that would be the future state. The current state is the three that are in front of you right now, okay, which you can appropriate from.
So just to help walk through as an example, so the last year that we had basically finished a year, with a surplus, and basically walk me through where those dollars went. You said 50% went into the stabilization fund of whatever was left over, which was about $3 million. 50% went into unassigned, or went into capital reserve fund? Unassigned. And then in this year's budget, you picked up $600,000 coming back out of the unassigned.
That's correct.
Which is less than the half of what was at the end of the previous year that went in there, right? So, but to what Alderman Budge said, it's not that basically every dollar at the end of the surplus to any year goes into the stabilization fund until it hits that 3%, and then it spills over. It's only 50% of whatever's left over, right?
50% of net revenue goes in.
Gotcha. So, and it takes you X amount of years of X amount of revenue or not, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then once you
How's the capital reserve fund funded?
Well, the capital reserve, the initial amount was $5 million.
So it was just staked out of the unassigned fund balance.
Exactly. Right.
So there's no plan, if we draw on it tonight, about how to replenish it?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the current policy, 50% of any future year surplus will go to budget stabilization fund and 50% will go to capital reserve fund.
So as soon as the capital reserve fund falls below the 5 million,
No,
No.
there's no threshold
Oh,
set to
really?
it at all. Yeah,
Okay.
no
There's
minimum,
no
no
target.
maximum. So 50% will always go to the capital reserve fund, the way it's written today. And 50% will go to the budget stabilization fund until it reaches a max of 3%, at which time it will fall to unassigned.
so in the example, the last year that we have hard numbers for, that $3 million, that's what happened, that's what got us to the 5 million on one side and the 1.5 on the other side, right?
No, the $5 million was explicit in the resolution that created the fund.
So because it was, okay,
First year,
first year.
yeah,
First year,
right.
So if that hadn't happened, if it wasn't the first year, and we had the same $3 million, we would have seen the budget stabilization go up to,
6.5.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, on the capital side, and then the budget stabilization would have gone, and it wouldn't have fallen to the unassigned
Right.
general fund balance. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. So, I mean, I guess the questions, I mean, there is obviously a system in place, it's helpful to know about it, because this
Well,
is
but what
sort of
are the
new. So
rules?
the question is, what sort of guardrails do you want to put on it?
Yeah,
going
what are the
forward?
rules for when you can take it out or not? Sounds like there's no rule for the capital reserve fund, we can run it down, there's no goal, if the goal isn't 6.44, the goal is 50% of whatever the surplus is every year, no matter what. The unassigned, again, the target is 15, we're at 20. I think the best practices was that we should be at 20, but
Could be even
again,
30. I mean,
is it just at our whim that we take it out, as long as we keep within these parameters? And then what are the rules about priorities? Should a priority be to make sure that our police and fire pension plan is fully funded, or that we have enough staff to do all of the work, or just what? And is there anything that tells us that we need to be looking for future potential spending needs, like TMDLs or storm or sea level rise or those sorts of things? And it just feels like we have some percentages, but we really have no guidance about how we use it if we get above. I do stand by what I said earlier. If we're bringing in more revenue than we really need, then we ought to not be increasing, we ought to be reducing taxes. I'm not convinced that we are bringing in more revenue than we really need, but I don't find any guidance. I don't think we have talked about this explicitly. We've talked around it a few times, but we keep
Yeah.
avoiding.
But now we have, I mean, having this sort of crystallized here gives you a sense sort of where the money is, and the question is then, it's left to each of us, or a majority of us, to decide, should you make more of a contribution to the pension plans? Is that now available to you for the next bargaining, because you now have a sense of what thresholds might be, and you get to, the majority of the council will get to put whatever sort of floors and ceilings on that as they want, but I mean, this is where the money is, and this is where the conversation should be. This is where where we're going. I was saying to Alderman Payon, I mean, right, this is a conversation we weren't having 2 or 3 years ago, because we didn't have these reserves,
Right.
right? So in some ways, this is a new debate for the council, but it is about, I mean, certainly in the context of what's happening this year and what the next 4 years will be. I mean, this is what, from my perspective, people should be thinking about, because this is where, if you spend it down too fast and you endanger yourself going forward, there's risk, and if you don't spend some of it on things that you think are important or stake out priorities, there's risk. So it should be where we should be focused, certainly on this committee and on the council. But I don't know what else, Alderman Arnett, aside from being aware of it, that we can do, unless you want to draft up an ordinance that starts to figure out about how to put guardrails on that, I guess.
Well, tonight or next Monday night, whenever we come to grips with it, we at least have the worksheet that Alderman Budge put together for us, and again, thank you, Joe, for that, that seems to be saying that we have $755,900 of revenue, including not making the tax rate reduction, and we have $400 million of proposed new spending without getting into some of the other monies that people are talking about for community grants and for other things, which is a deficit. More spending is being proposed than there's revenue, even implicitly dipping into fund balance. And so, yeah, I'm not prepared to, most of this affects the general fund. I don't know how I want to vote on this. I'm not comfortable with voting on it till we have a more specific discussion.
Well, it'll be fun this evening. We can get into that. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the reality is, and we heard today, I mean, the thresholds that are in place in the current effective ordinance on the unassigned general fund balance don't stop anyone from, in the administration or from many of us, from drawing on those dollar amounts. There's nothing that's being done that's illegal or unlawful. The question is, do you think it's
just
wise?
unmindful.
Yeah, and that should be the conversation. This will be
Right.
helpful to have that conversation.
Right.
Sure, Alderman Finlayson.
Couple questions. And the first one's for Mr. Andrews. Were departments asked to cut their budgets within the current year?
No, ma'am.
So the surplus that we have, or
There was
we
no-
expect to have,
There was no across the
has
board.
nothing to do with departmental.
The departments were given instructions. The departments were to maintain a level budget, and then they were given the amount of money that we would, additional amount of money for salaries and steps and those kinds of things.
Okay, I'm not talking about for 18 though. I'm talking about within this current year.
Oh, no, same
where
thing.
they
Level
asked for
budget
curb
with,
spending.
level
Okay.
budget with consideration for the steps and salary requirement, benefit requirement.
Okay, so the surplus that we have is not related in any way to departmental cuts to their budget.
The instructions are always to be prudent, however.
Was there a percent to which they were to be prudent? Okay. Because my question was going to be how we restore funding to them. You know, as Alderman Arnett said, I'm very aware, and I hope we're all becoming more aware of the understaffing that we have and the extremely poor morale within our departments because there's little consideration given for our staffing positions. So I just want to make sure that that wasn't an issue. My next question is for Mr. Miller. Rainy day fund, stabilization fund, reserve fund, unassigned fund, they're really all the same fund. Now, they're not the same fund because we've chosen to put these monies in different categories. But we define, as the policymakers, how they will be used. But really, we're all talking about fund balance.
You're absolutely correct.
Okay.
The only caveat I would put on that is not to confuse the restricted part, but everything else is,
Okay, so we could have two accounts. We could have a restricted account and an unrestricted account and be done.
and that's how we were 2 years ago.
Mhm.
So there's two classifications.
Okay, so I
And-
just want to be clear.
Yes,
that
ma'am.
we really don't need all these accounts. It causes a great deal of confusion, and the community thinks that we're hiding money in all these different accounts, and that's why it's not clear cut, you know, exactly what it is. So I just wanted to make that clear.
We're not hiding?
Well, you made the comment at the last meeting, so that has resonated throughout the community.
Okay. Any other
Thank you.
questions or comments? Need a motion to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.